right, testing. Great. Okay, so let's jump in. Pay no attention to the chapter titles on all these lecture slides. Um, they're all published by McGraw-Hill, and so they'll all usually use the same figures. Doesn't really matter what uh, textbook we're basing it on. They all share the same figures. And all right, so here we have the autonomic nervous system. So compare that to the somatic nervous system, which we briefly discussed. This works on processes that are perceived or consciously controlled. Uh, for instance, all the things that we're consciously aware of, the temperature of our body, pressure, pain, temperature. Did I mention that already? No, I said pressure. Okay. And vibration, things like that that we're consciously aware of coming from the skin, joints, bones, and muscle. That's the sensory division of the somatic nervous system. And then the motor division controls skeletal muscle, right, which we can consciously control. Uh, Now contrast that with the autonomic nervous system, which regulates processes below the conscious level. In other words, it operates subconsciously, we're not aware of it, and it works to maintain homeostasis. So it reflexively responds to visceral sensory inputs. For instance, blood vessel stretch. We have stretch detectors in, for instance, the aorta and the carotid bodies and the carotid sinus, which are going to detect basically the level of stretch in the blood vessel, which tells us about blood pressure, right? The higher the blood pressure, the more the vessel is stretched. And then it sends impulses to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands to get an effect. So, in the example of the stretch detectors, the stretch receptors in the aorta, right? When our blood pressure is high, that's going to get stretched out. The blood vessel it'll expand. The stretch receptors detect that, and they send impulses to the midbrain, which are going to respond by telling the smooth muscle in the aorta to relax, which will help lower blood pressure. All right, on the left here we have the somatic nervous system. So you have the skin here. Most of our receptors in the somatic nervous system, most of them will be embedded in the skin. Here we have labeled sensory receptors. This one would probably detect pressure, things like that. And so, um, you're laying there and then suddenly you feel weight on your chest. Um, you're detecting your cat has jumped up on your chest while you sleep, right? And that would be detected with these pressure receptors in the skin. That information is carried to the um, spinal cord, and then it's integrated with an interneuron. All right, and then the response is sent out over the efferent fibers, the motor fiber here, to skeletal muscle to move your cat away or something like that. Or maybe with some different receptors, we could detect, um, mm, let's say that there's a bug. You could feel a spider crawling on you, right? All right, and so that information would be carried to the spinal cord, integrated, and then the response would be sent out over the motor fibers to move skeletal muscle to sweep the bug off of your skin. Over here we have the autonomic nervous system, which is receiving information from the lungs, and we can detect in the lungs things like stretch, right? And so the stretch receptors detect when the lungs are inflated or hyperinflated, and it sends that information back to the spinal cord where it gets integrated. And then on the other side of the reflex, we send out a motor response over efferent autonomic fibers. All right. And they're going to ultimately reach the lungs and control muscle there to cause us to expire, right? It'll encourage expiration so that we don't hyperinflate or overinflate the lungs because that would damage them. Now, one key thing here to note in the diagram is that there are two neurons in the motor pathway of the autonomic nervous system. They're pretty much always not always, but almost always, two neurons. And so one is going to have its neurosoma in the lateral horn of the gray matter. All right, that's the preganglionic fiber. And then its axon runs out down to a ganglion, which is sort of a swelling of nervous tissue outside the spinal cord, remember. And this paravertebral ganglion is going to contain the neurosomas of the postganglionic fibers. Remember, pre is before, post is after. And so the preganglionic fiber has its soma in the lateral horn. It runs out, its axon does, to the ganglion. And then in this ganglion, we find the neurosoma of the postsynaptic neuron, which is going to run after or past the ganglion out to the target tissue. Remember, in the autonomic nervous system, it was one motor fiber all the way down. And in the autonomic system, there's going to be two fibers, a preganglionic and a postganglionic fiber. And we just said that. Here, it's calling it a ganglionic fiber. Most textbooks are going to call it a postganglionic fiber, preganglionic and postganglionic. Although ganglionic's a fine name because its soma is actually in the ganglion. All right. All right, so again, we see the preganglionic fiber. It's going to run out to the ganglion. Now, in the ganglion, we're going to be releasing acetylcholine. All right, so the preganglionic fiber will always be releasing acetylcholine. And these should be, I believe, nicotinic receptors in the ganglion. All right, and so we should see nicotinic receptors, nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic axon. Now, down at the other end of the postganglionic axon, it can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending on which neuron it is. Okay? Some will release acetylcholine, and some will release norepinephrine. But usually, when they release acetylcholine, it will be to muscarinic receptors. All right, so the first neuron, as we said, is the preganglionic neuron, and its cell body is in the lateral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. It is a myelinated axon that extends to the second cell, which is found in the autonomic ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system, again, that's outside the spinal cord. All right, and so the preganglionic neuron releases, as we said, acetylcholine, which will excite the postganglionic neuron, the second neuron. All right, so the postganglionic neuron extends out to the effector cells, and that effector is going to be muscle or gland. In this case, it'll be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland, not skeletal muscle. All right, so as we said before, the autonomic nervous system has two big divisions, and that's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. As we said, the parasympathetic is known as the rest and digest system, and that's going to help conserve and replenish nutrient stores. It's going to aid in digestion and just carrying out the day-to-day work that it takes to keep the body alive and functioning. All right. The sympathetic division is known as the fight or flight division, and that's going to get the body ready to respond to emergencies, right? So as we said, you walk around the corner and you see a saber-toothed tiger or your ex or a zombie saber-toothed tiger, one of those. That's going to get your heart racing because you've activated the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to get your body ready to go, to fight or to flee. And so you're going to start breaking down glycogen in the liver and in skeletal muscle to increase glucose availability to the muscle and brain. Liver liberates it for the brain, and muscle breaks down glycogen and then keeps the glucose. It doesn't share with anybody. All right, we're going to divert blood to the skeletal muscle to increase our readiness. We're going to dilate our eyes so that we can take in more information. All right, just get us ready to take action. So the two systems are going to differ in the length of their axons. Really, maybe a better way to think about it is they're going to differ in the distance to the ganglion, right? And so the parasympathetic system has long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. All right. On the other hand, the sympathetic division has short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. So that cartoon we just saw, a couple slides back, okay, not that one, this one, is showing us a sympathetic fibers. And so we see it's a short distance outside of the spinal cord to the ganglion, and then it's a long distance from the ganglion to the lungs. Now, of course, this is not drawn to scale, but the paravertebral ganglia are right outside the spinal cord, okay? And then it's a longer distance to the effectors, which would be the muscle around the thoracic cage in that example. Oh, also the location of the ganglia. So the parasympathetic ganglia are going to be close to the effector, and the sympathetic ganglia are going to be near the spinal cord. That almost goes without saying because, or rather, the length of the axons goes without saying because of the location of the ganglia, right? So the sympathetic ganglia are right next to the spinal cord, and so of course the preganglionic fiber is going to be short in order to reach a ganglion right outside the spinal cord. And then you're typically going to have a long way to go to get to your target organ from there. On the other hand, the parasympathetic ganglia are going to be next to the effector, sometimes embedded actually in the organ. And so the distance to the organ for the preganglionic fiber will be long, but the distance to the organ for the postganglionic fiber will be short in the parasympathetic system. All right, so we've seen a lot of this. So the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar nervous system, or the thoracolumbar division of the autonomic nervous system. And the reason for that is that the nerve fibers that are used in this division of the autonomic nervous system, they all arise from the levels of T1 through L2, right? So they're all going to be exiting between thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, okay? And then you can see here in the sympathetic, the ganglia are right outside the spinal cord on either side of the spinal cord. All right, now on the other hand, the parasympathetic division is known as the craniosacral division because many of the fibers, many of the nerves involved in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system will arise from cranial nerves or sacral nerves. Okay, and actually, probably the single most important one is cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, if you remember from the end of the last lecture, it goes everywhere, and that's part of the parasympathetic division. It goes almost everywhere. All right, so yeah, we've said this already. All right, so parasympathetic pathways. You can see cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. 10 is really important. That's the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve innervates the heart, the smooth muscle around the trachea, in the bronchioles, the digestive organs, pretty much all of them, as well as the accessory organs, and the spleen. Innervates the gonads as well, okay, the testes and the ovary. The sacral nerves, or the sacral part of the craniosacral division, is going to innervate the uterus, the vagina, and the external genitalia, specifically the penis and clitoris, and the bladder. All right, so the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, we mentioned, it projects inferiorly through the neck to innervate the thoracic and abdominal organs. We see activity in branches of the thoracic organs will increase. Mucus production, decrease airway diameter, basically constrict the airways and decrease the heart rate and force of contraction. Now, parasympathetic nervous system is known as the rest and digest. And so it makes sense that we would want to increase the diameter of the airway for responding to a threat, right? Like we're going to need to run in a second. So increasing the diameter of the airway makes sense because now we can get more air in. But why would you ever want to constrict it? Right. Well, you would want to constrict it basically to decrease the flow of air. One, when it's not necessary, and two, to prevent pathogens from getting in. All right, so when we're resting and digesting and we're just sitting around living day to day using the parasympathetic system, we are going to want to decrease the diameter of the airway. We're going to want to constrict, and that's going to protect us from pathogens that we might breathe in. All right. Okay, so moving on. We will also decrease the heart rate as well as the force of contraction. Actually, we have a greater effect on decreasing the heart rate with the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's going to decrease blood pressure, which is good because high blood pressure can damage blood vessels, and it can also lead to stroke. And if you had a clotting disorder, it could lead to hemorrhage. All right. Good. So we need to keep our blood pressure low when we're not facing a threat. On the other hand, when you are facing a threat, you need to increase the heart rate and increase blood pressure so that you can get more blood carrying more oxygen and more glucose to the tissues. But that's when you're facing a threat. Once that threat's gone, you need to relax and stop doing that. High blood glucose also, by the way, can damage your blood vessels. All right. And so, as we said, the sympathetic division, also known as the thoracolumbar division, it's a bit more complex than the sympathetic division. Here, the axons are going to travel with the somatic motor axons as they exit the spinal cord through the anterior roots and then out through the levels of T1 through L2. All right, and we've seen this diagram already. Oh, well, no, I'm not sure we did. It actually was very similar for the parasympathetic system, but no, this is the sympathetic system here. You can see that we are innervating more or less the same tissues. We are not innervating the extrinsic eye muscles. However, we are innervating here the pupillary muscles, or rather the ciliary body inside the iris, as well as the iris, so that we can control the diameter of the iris, right? And when we tell the iris to contract, it's going to actually dilate the pupil, and that's going to let more light in. That's important when we're facing a threat, something that might kill us, because then we can take in more information, we can see more, and respond to the threat better. All right. Now, when we're relaxing, parasympathetic is not going to tell that muscle to contract, so it'll relax on its own. All right. The more light we let in, the more damage we take to our eyes. So ideally, the sympathetic system in almost every example is only activated for short bits at a time. I mean, there will always be some sympathetic activity, but we don't want the sympathetic system to take over long term because that will lead to damage to tissues. All right, but again, you can see we're innervating roughly the same tissues. We're innervating the heart and the blood vessels. And actually, we are going to increase the force of contraction. We will have a fairly strong effect here in the heart with the sympathetic system. Of course, we'll also increase the heart rate. All right, we will also control the muscles that are responsible for respiration, and we will uh, uh, dilate the airways so that we can take in more air when we're getting ready to run or fight something. All right, and then you can see also that we are innervating the abdominal organs, the digestive organs, same as we were with the parasympathetic system. All right. Here, the sympathetic system is, yes, also going to um, innervate the testes and the ovaries as well as the vagina and the uterus. It's important to note, because it'll come up again in the reproductive unit, that the sympathetic system is also innervating, though, the prostate, the seminal vesicles, the vas deferens. So the seminal vesicles and the prostate are involved in producing seminal fluid or ejaculate. All right, and so sexual arousal is controlled by the parasympathetic system, as we saw with the external genitalia, the penis, and the clitoris. Um, but orgasm is actually controlled by the sympathetic system. All right. All right, so sympathetic trunks are located anterior to the spinal nerves and then immediately lateral to the vertebral column. The sympathetic trunk ganglia house sympathetic ganglionic neuron cell bodies, and one sympathetic ganglion typically is associated with each spinal nerve. So to explain that, we go back to this picture, okay, and so you can see that each level of the spinal cord, here we have T1, has its own ganglion, and then while there is no nerve exiting at the level of C8, at least not in regards to the sympathetic nervous system, there are still ganglia at these levels as we go up, but T1, T2, T3 have their own ganglia. All right, so these are the paravertebral ganglia, which make up the sympathetic trunk. Okay. Sympathetic trunk ganglia, another name for the paravertebral ganglia. Here is the posterior of the chest wall. You can see the aorta. You can see the superior vena cava here. You can see the rib bones. All right. And then in between, you can see the nerves. And then here's really what's key from the picture, and that's the sympathetic trunk or the paravertebral ganglia. You can see those ganglia here, right? These swellings in the nervous tissue, right? So all sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to originate in lateral gray horns from the levels of T1 to L2. Those axons travel with the T1 to L2 spinal nerves, then leave the nerves and travel through the white rami to enter the sympathetic trunk. Inside the sympathetic trunk, the preganglionic axons may remain at the level of entry, that is where they entered, or travel superiorly or inferiorly. In other words, if a fiber were to exit the spinal cord at the level of T3, what this is saying is that the fibers may remain at the level of T3 or go up to T2 or go down to T4. It almost goes without saying. So the axons then exit the sympathetic trunk through four possible pathways. We have the spinal nerve pathway, spinal nerve pathway, the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway, splanchnic nerve pathway, and the adrenal medulla pathway. All right. So for the spinal nerve pathway, we see that the preganglionic axon terminates in the sympathetic trunk. Okay. Sympathetic trunk, preganglionic axon terminates here. And the postganglionic neuron is going to exit through the gray ramus at the same level and extend within the spinal nerve to the target organ. All right, to the target organ. The postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. Here, the preganglionic axon will terminate in the sympathetic trunk, as we see, And then the postganglionic neuron extends directly to the target organ through here. All right, directly to the target organ. The sympathetic division may modulate activity in one effector or in many effectors simultaneously, and in crisis situations, we see mass activation, which is the simultaneous stimulation of many effectors. And you've experienced this at some point, right? You've been scared and you jump, your heart rate increases, your breathing rate increases, your eyes dilate, all this fun stuff. Your blood pressure increases, although you are probably not consciously aware that your blood pressure increased. All these things happen all at once. It's known as mass activation. All right, so the enteric nervous system is an array of neurons that are found in the wall of the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract. Excuse me. And this innervates the smooth muscle and glands and coordinates peristalsis. Remember, peristalsis is that rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscle in the walls of the digestive organs. And that rhythmic contraction propels food forward down the GI tract. As I said before, you remember this morning you ate a power bar and you probably stopped sensing it about 1/3 of the way down your esophagus, and then the next day it winds up at the back door. And how does that happen? Peristalsis. Anyway, the enteric nervous system includes neurons from two large plexuses, the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. The submucosal plexus is located in the submucosa of the wall of these organs, and then the myenteric plexus is located in the muscle layer surrounding, as part of the muscle wall here. So the submucosal plexus is going to control secretion from the glands, as well as absorption and mucosal folding. And the myenteric plexus is going to control the smooth muscle. You could get that from myo, right? Myo muscle. Entero refers to the GI tract, and so myenteric is muscle in the wall of the GI tract. All right, so its activity is stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system and inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system. So one thing we didn't mention is that when you see this zombie or saber-toothed tiger or anything like that, when you feel that sudden fear and then that response to run or to fight it, in addition to increasing the airways so that you can take in more air, in addition to increasing the blood pressure, increasing the blood glucose, all those things. One other thing you're going to do is stop digesting. All right, and so there's no thought behind it, but if there were, the thought would be, I can always digest this stuff later if I survive, and if I don't survive, then I don't have to worry about it ever. So you just go ahead and stop digestion. Now, the real reason we do this is that when we digest, blood gets diverted to the digestive organs. But we need that blood going to skeletal muscle to power skeletal muscle. So we shunt blood away from the digestive organs, which shuts down digestion. Then we send that blood to the digestive organs. You'll also, by the way, frequently turn pale when you're frightened. And the reason for that is you've activated the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, and you're going to be shunting blood away from the skin. You turn pale because you've shunted blood away from the skin so that you can send it again to the skeletal muscle to help you run or fight. All right. So in many ways, almost every way, they oppose each other, the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So all preganglionic axons are going to release acetylcholine, which has an excitatory effect on the ganglionic or postganglionic cell. Acetylcholine releasing cells are called cholinergic. These are cholinergic neurons or cholinergic synapses. All postganglionic parasympathetic axons and a few of the postganglionic sympathetic axons are going to release acetylcholine. So in the parasympathetic system, it will always be acetylcholine from the postganglionic fiber. In the sympathetic system, only some of the postganglionic fibers will release acetylcholine to the effector. All right, so depending on the type of receptor on the effector, acetylcholine from the parasympathetic postganglionic axons may cause excitation or inhibition. And of course, these receptors we know can be muscarinic or nicotinic. Of course, nicotinic is going to be excitatory and muscarinic typically inhibitory, although that can vary. All right, so the acetylcholine released from the sympathetic axons is excitatory only, both in the ganglion and at effectors such as sweat glands and blood vessels in the skeletal muscle. Most postganglionic sympathetic axons release norepinephrine on the effector. All right, so in the sympathetic system, most postganglionic fibers will release norepinephrine. And then depending on the specific type of adrenergic receptor, norepinephrine has an excitatory or inhibitory effect. Now, we said, just to get our terminology straight, we said that acetylcholine synapses are called cholinergic synapses, and the fibers are called cholinergic fibers. When we use the term adrenergic, we're referring to neurons that release norepinephrine. Now, why would we use that term adrenergic? For acetylcholine synapses, cholinergic kind of makes sense, right? Choline, right? Adrenergic refers to adrenaline, and epinephrine and norepinephrine actually have other names, which are adrenaline and noradrenaline. And I can't remember which is which. It's another one of those things where the British and the Americans use different terms. I want to say adrenaline, even though colloquially many Americans use the term adrenaline, the word adrenaline. American physicians and scientists use the term epinephrine, whereas in Britain, I believe it's commonplace to use the term adrenaline. In either case, the world has decided to use the term epinephrine and norepinephrine for the two different hormones that we're talking about here. And so the synapses can also be called adrenergic synapses. And the fibers can be called adrenergic fibers because adrenaline is another name for epinephrine, and noradrenaline is another name for norepinephrine. All right. Let me get some water real quick. All right. So here is a diagram showing you all the different combinations for preganglionic and postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. Parasympathetic is easy. Preganglionic fiber releases acetylcholine, and that binds to nicotinic receptors. The postganglionic fiber releases acetylcholine, and that binds to muscarinic receptors. Always in the parasympathetic system. In the sympathetic system, the preganglionic fiber always releases acetylcholine that binds to nicotinic receptors. All right. Now, the postganglionic neuron can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. The fibers that release acetylcholine are called cholinergic in both systems, and the fibers that release norepinephrine are called adrenergic. All right. And so norepinephrine is only released by the sympathetic system at some, actually most, of its postganglionic neurons. All right. Now the target here will be also muscarinic receptors or adrenergic receptors for the norepinephrine. Or we can have this other system where there's actually only the preganglionic fiber. There's only one fiber. The ganglion, in this case, is actually embedded in the wall of the adrenal medulla. So um, there's actually no post-ganglionic fiber. And so we release acetylcholine here at the adrenal medulla, and that diffuses across and binds to muscarinic receptors. This is only the case at the adrenal medulla. All right, so autonomic tone. Sustained activity in sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions sets the autonomic tone that regulates target organs. In other words, both are pretty much always constantly working, and they oppose each other. And so whichever one's kind of more active is going to determine the activity of the body. So the activity level of just one division can regulate an effector. So if the sympathetic activity decreases from the baseline tone, basically the sympathetic neurons are firing, let's go ahead and say 100 times a second. And if that decreases to 50 times a second, if the sympathetic neurons fire 50 times a second as opposed to 100, which is normal, then we will see more activity on the parasympathetic side, or that is to say that the parasympathetic system will take over. All right. If sympathetic activity increases, on the other hand, we're going to see sympathetic activity take over. So the example here are blood vessels. If sympathetic activity decreases, the blood vessels dilate, and if it increases, they constrict. All right, so many effectors have dual innervation, meaning they're innervated by both systems and they receive input from, yeah, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And these divisions, they can either oppose each other or cooperate. Typically, they oppose each other. So the parasympathetic activity will slow the heart, while the sympathetic activity speeds it up. Uh, and if we think about this in terms of blood pressure instead of heart rate, parasympathetic activity will slow the heart rate, which drops the blood pressure. Sympathetic activity will speed up the heart rate, which increases blood pressure. Sympathetic activity will also increase the force of contraction, which will also increase blood pressure. All right, so the parasympathetic activity will increase intestinal motility. In other words, the rate at which we move things through the intestines. And sympathetic activity will decrease it. So if you're stressed out, you may get constipated. In parasympathetic activity, we will see the pupil constrict, and that is to say the diameter of the pupil decreases, it gets smaller. Sympathetic activity dilates the pupil, and we're going to see that the pupil expands, and the pupil is actually a window into the eye. It lets light pass into the eye. That's why that's significant. All right, and then it says here they have cooperative effects. In the male sexual response, you see the parasympathetic activity leads to erection, but the sympathetic activity leads to ejaculation. I actually think these two kind of oppose each other. I mean, this is just my opinion. You know, you can argue it, but so the parasympathetic activity leads to erection. It leads to sexual arousal and excitement and aids in sexual activity. Whereas because the sympathetic activity leads to ejaculation, which follows orgasm and terminates sexual activity, just in my opinion here, the sympathetic system is actually ending sexual activity. So that whatever. So some people say they work together. In that particular example, I think they work against each other. All right, so some effectors are controlled by an increase or decrease in sympathetic activity compared to their baseline. So we mentioned the blood vessels earlier. The blood vessels will dilate with decreased sympathetic activity, constrict with increased activity. We'll also see, though, sweat secretion on the trunk, the adrenal medulla secretion of hormones, and the erector pili muscles contracting, and that all varies directly with the sympathetic tone. Tone, again, is the rate at which these neurons are depolarizing, the rate at which they're firing. A lot of these neurons fire at a constant rate, and when their rate changes, then we see effects. All right, so involuntary autonomic reflexes help maintain homeostasis, and this consists of smooth muscle contractions, cardiac muscle contractions, or gland secretion in response to a stimulus. So, for example, we see the moment to moment control of blood pressure. And we talked about that example a little bit ago. Basically, we have stretch receptors in the aorta and the carotid bodies in the carotid sinus. And in both of these cases, we're talking about stretch receptors. And they will also, by the way, fire at a constant rate. And when their rate decreases, we know that blood pressure has dropped. They are less stretched. And so we need to increase the heart rate and the force of contraction to increase blood pressure. On the other hand, if they are firing more often, then they are stretched out, and we need to activate the parasympathetic system and tell the heart slow down to decrease the blood pressure. All right, so the example we have here is the urinary bladder, also known as the detrusor muscle, the smooth muscle in the wall of the urinary bladder. When it is stretched, it activates stretch receptors, which pass that information onto sensory neurons that travel back, okay, and then through the dorsal root. And just like in the somatic nervous system, we see the neurosoma is in the dorsal root ganglion. All right. And then they pass that information onto an interneuron in the spinal cord, which integrates the information and decides what response, if any, is necessary. In this case, in this reflex, the response is going to be activation of the motor pathway that leads to, ultimately, the smooth muscle. Whoa! Smooth muscle in the wall of the urinary bladder, and it causes contraction that causes us to expel urine or urine. So autonomic function is influenced by parts of the CNS, including the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. The hypothalamus is the integration center for the autonomic nervous system, and it's crucial also in emotion, and it regulates visceral function or the function of the internal organs, the abdominal organs specifically. The brainstem has centers or nuclei that are responsible for cardiovascular functions, also digestive functions, as well as the eye's pupil and lens shape. And then the spinal cord is important for parasympathetic reflexes involved in defecation and urination as we just saw. All right, well, that's it for today. As always, email me if you have any questions. We're going to come back next time and finish up with the senses, both general and special.